Why the withdrawal from Kherson of Russia from Ukraine can be seen as a kind of an anti-Stalingrad right, the prevailing interpretation scenario of the difficult choice, quote unquote. In January 1944, that's the Second World War, the newly reconstituted German Sixth Army found itself in an operational quagmire at the southern bend of the Dnieper River in the area of Krivoy Rog and Nikopol. The Germans occupied a dangerous point, protruding precariously into the Red Army lines. Vulnerable to two awkward flanks and facing an enemy superior in manpower and firepower, any sane general would have tried to withdraw as soon as possible. In this case, however, Hitler insisted that the Wehrmacht held the most important because the area was Germany's last remaining source of manganese. It was a mineral vital to the production of high-quality steel. A year earlier, in the early weeks of 1943, Hitler had intervened in another, more famous battle, preventing the previous incarnation of the Sixth Army from breaking through an enclave forming around it at Stalingrad. With the withdrawal ban, the Sixth was generally disseminated. In both these cases, there was a conflict between pure military prudence and wider political aim and needs. In 1943, there was neither a compelling military nor political reason to keep the Sixth Army of Germany in the Stalingrad enclave. Political interference in military decision-making was as irrational as it was disastrous. In 1944, however, Hitler, as hard as it is to admit, had a valid argument. Without manganese from the Nicopolis area, German war production was doomed. In this case, political intervention was perhaps justified. Leaving an army in a vulnerable spot is bad, but so is running out of manganese. These two Sixth Army tragedies illustrate the important issue today. How do we analyze the difference between military and civilian decision-making? More specifically, to what do we attribute Russia's shocking decision to withdraw from the west bank of the Dnieper in the Kherson region after annexing it only a few months ago? First, one cannot deny that the withdrawal is politically a significant humiliation for Russia. The question arises, however, whether this sacrifice was necessary for military or political reasons, and what it might mean for the future course of the conflict. Logically, the withdrawal from the west bank of Kherson should be guided by one of the following four possibilities. The Ukrainian army defeated the Russian army on the west bank and drove them back across the river. Or Russia is setting a trap in Kherson. Or a secret peace deal, or at least a ceasefire, has been negotiated, which includes the return of Kherson to Ukraine. Or Russia made a politically embarrassing but militarily prudent operational choice. Let's just look at these four and consider them in order. Possibility 1, military defeat for Russia. The recapture of Kherson is rightly celebrated by Ukrainians as a victory. The question is, what kind of victory is it? Is it political, communication, or military? It becomes inescapably obvious that it's the first kind. Political. So let's consider some facts. At first, as recently as the morning of November 9, hours before the withdrawal was announced, some Russian war correspondents were skeptical of withdrawal rumors because Russia's defense lines were completely intact. There did not appear to be a crisis between Russian forces in the region. Second, Ukraine was not conducting vigorous offensive efforts in the region at the time the withdrawal began, and Ukrainian officials expressed skepticism that the withdrawal was even real. Indeed, the idea that Russia was setting a trap comes from Ukrainian officials who were apparently stunned by the withdrawal. Ukraine was not ready to pursue or exploit and stepped cautiously into the void after the Russian soldiers left. Even with the withdrawal of Russia, they were clearly afraid to advance because their last attempts to breach the defenses in the area became mass casualty events. Overall, Russia's withdrawal was implemented very quickly with minimal pressure from the Ukrainians. This very fact is the basis of the idea that it's either a trap or the result of a backroom deal. In both cases, Russia simply slipped back across the river without Ukrainian pursuit, suffering negligible casualties and taking out almost all of its equipment. So far, a damaged T-90 is Ukraine's only notable seizure. The net score on the Kherson front remains a strong imbalance of losses in favor of Russia, and they retire once again without a defeat on their field. And the field in their battle, and with their forces intact. Possibility 2, it's a trap. This theory surfaced very soon after withdrawal was announced. It came from Ukrainian officials who were taken aback by the announcement and was then ironically reproduced by Russian supporters who hoped that 4D chess was being played. It's not. Russia plays standard 2D chess, which is the only kind of chess there is, but more on that later. It's not clear exactly what trap is supposed to mean. There are two possible interpretations of this. One, a conventional battlefield maneuver involving a timely counterattack, and two, some sort of unconventional move, such as a tactical nuke or, by failure, a dam collapse. It's clear that there is no counter on the battlefield for the simple reason that Russia has thrown the bridges behind them. With no Russian forces left on the West Bank and the bridges destroyed, there's no immediate ability for either army to attack the other in force. Of course, they can bomb each other across the river, but the actual line of contact is frozen for now. This leaves open the possibility that Russia intends to do something unconventional, such as using a low-yield nuke. The idea that Russia lured Ukraine into Kherson to detonate a nuke is silly. If Russia wanted to use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine, which it doesn't, there's no logical reason why it would choose a regional capital they annexed as a place to do so. Russia has no shortage of conventional systems. If they wanted to shoot up Ukraine, quite simply, they wouldn't have bothered to leave their own city and make it the blast site. They would just hit Ukraine. It's not a trap. Possibility 3. Collusion. This was prompted by the news that U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was in contact with his Russian counterpart, and specifically the feeling that the White House was pushing for negotiations. Under a rumored variant of the Sullivan Accord, Ukraine would recognize Russia's annexations east of the Dnieper, while the west bank of the Kherson would return to Kiev's control. In other words, the Dnieper River would be the border. Unlikely for several reasons. First, such a deal would represent an extremely ferocious Russian victory, while achieving the liberation of Donbass, one of the SMO's stated goals. It would leave Ukraine largely intact and strong enough to be an eternal thorn as a hostile anti-Russian state. There would be the problem of Ukraine's possible further integration into NATO, and above all, the open surrender of an annexed regional capital. On the Ukrainian side, the point is that the recovery of Kherson only reinforces the false perception in Kiev that total victory is possible and that Crimea and Donbass can be fully recovered. Ukraine is enjoying a series of territorial advances and feels that now is its time of opportunity. Ultimately, there seems to be no agreement that satisfied both sides, and this reflects that the innate hostility between the two nations must be resolved on the battlefield. While the world was fixated on the relatively bloodless change of hands of Kherson, Russia and Ukraine fought a bloody battle over Pavlovka, and Russia won. Ukraine also tried to break the Russian defenses on the Svatov axis and was repulsed with heavy losses. Ultimately, the main reason to doubt the news of a secret deal is the fact that the war continues on all other fronts, and Ukraine is losing. That leaves only one choice. Option 4. Difficult business choice. This withdrawal was discreetly signaled shortly after General Surovikin was put in charge of the Operation Ukraine. In his first press conference, he signaled displeasure over the Kherson front, calling the situation tense and difficult, and citing Ukraine's threat to dam the Dnieper and flood the region. Shortly thereafter, the process of evacuating citizens from Kherson began. And that's why Surovikin decided and acted like this for Kherson. Kherson has become an ineffective front for Russia due to the logistic strain of providing forces along the river with limited bridge and road capacity. Russia proved that it was capable of shouldering this sustainment burden, keeping troops supplied throughout Ukraine's summer offensives. But the question is one, for what, and two, for how long? Ideally, the bridgehead becomes the starting point for offensive action against Nikolaev, but launching an attack would require the reinforcement of Group 2 of Namion in Kherson, which correspondingly increases the logistical burden of power projection across the river. With a very long front to play, Kherson is clearly one of the most logistically intensive axes. The guess is that the General Surovikin, took charge and almost immediately decided he did not want to increase the retention burden by trying to pressure Nikolaev. Therefore, if an attack is not going to be launched from the Kherson position, the question is, why hold the position? Politically, it's important to defend a regional capital, but militarily the position becomes meaningless if one is not going to proceed with the attack in the south. Let's be even more clear. Unless an attack against Nikolaev is planned, the Kherson bridgehead is militarily counterproductive. While holding the bridgehead at Kherson, the Dnieper River becomes a negative force multiplier, increasing the burden of maintenance and logistics, and always threatening to cut off forces if Ukraine succeeds in destroying the bridges or breaching the dam. Projecting power across the river becomes a heavy burden with no apparent benefit, but with the withdrawal to the east bank, the river becomes a positive force multiplier by serving as a defensive barrier. In the broader operational sense, Surovikin appears to be winding down fighting in the south while preparing in the north and Donbass. It's clear he made this decision shortly after taking over the business. He's been hinting at it for weeks, and the speed and clarity of the withdrawal suggests it was well planned, well in advance. The withdrawal along the river significantly increases the combat effectiveness of the army and reduces the logistical burden, freeing up resources for other sectors. This fits the general Russian pattern of making hard choices about resource allocation, fighting this war under the simple framework of optimizing casualty ratios and building the perfect meat grinder. Unlike the German army in the Second World War, the Russian army seems to be free from political interference in making rational military decisions. In this way, the withdrawal from Kherson can be seen as a kind of Anti-Stalingrad. Instead of political interference impeding the military, we have the military free to make operational choices, even at the cost of embarrassing politicians. And that, after all, is the smartest, if visually humiliating, way to wage a war. This is by Dipen News, and I've translated those for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.